It was a sunny winter afternoon, February 26, 2011, and an amateur model airplane pilot named Ilario Scotti was flying his radio-controlled plane over a field in the small town of Chignolo d'Isola, north of Bergamo. After flying a while over the industrial buildings and stretches of scrubland, Ilario's plane began to misbehave, and so he landed it in a nearby field. When he went to retrieve it, he noticed what looked like rags nearby. Thinking it was illegal dumping, he did a double take when he realized it was actually a person, a body face down in the tall weeds. He called the police, and it didn't take long to ascertain that this middle-aged amateur model airplane enthusiast had discovered the murdered body of 13-year-old Yara Gambirasio, who had been missing from her nearby home for the past 3 months. Yara, even after 3 months abandoned in a field, was still wearing her black leggings, her fur-lined sneakers, and her Hello Kitty sweatshirt. Still with Yara were those iconic metal braces visible in the thousands of photos that family and friends had shared with the media. This discovery, as painful as it was for Yara's family, would lead to the resolution of a brutal murder that shocked a nation and is still ranked among Italians as one of the most followed crime cases in history. This is the story of Yara. Hello and benvenuti to Italian True Crime. Today's case brings us to the far north of Italy, to a small village of about 7,000 called Brembate di Sopra. Brembate is very close to Bergamo, about 7 kilometers, and not even that far from Milan, about 45 kilometers to the northeast. It is right under the Alps and is populated with small villages full of rugged mountain people. The people of this area are culturally closer to the Swiss than to the Napolitani, and are generally more reserved than their southern countrymen. Here people keep to themselves, disdain gossip, and don't repeat nonsense. Brembate is surrounded by vineyards as well. It is located in the Franciacorta wine region, which is considered one of Italy's best sparkling wines. In this beautiful environment, a young girl named Yara lived with her close-knit family. They were a typical middle-class household. Yara's father, Fulvio, worked as a surveyor and was involved in construction. Her mother, Mara, was a teacher at a school in a nearby town. Yara had a sister, 2 years older, named Keba, and 2 smaller brothers, Nathan and Gioele, both under 10 years old. It seems the family had a penchant for choosing interesting first names. Italy has both tradition and rules regarding the parents' choice of their child's first name or baptized name. Traditions vary by region, but generally children are named for saints, so names like Giovanni, Leonardo, Francesco, Giuseppe for boys, or Emilia, Raffaella, Luisella for girls. Often there are several children at school with the same name because of this naming custom. This is one reason why you will often hear kids at school calling each other by their last names so as to avoid confusion. But an Italian parent is not completely free to name his or her child at random. Though there is not a database or list of acceptable names, as some have claimed, there are rules, and these rules can and have been enforced. For example, the chosen name must be recognizable as a first name and should not be a last name. Also, the name should not cause embarrassment to the child. The rule actually specifically mentions a few names that are outlawed, such as Satan and Lucifer. Likewise, geographic names are against the rules, though there are exceptions listed, such as Italia, Asia, Europa, and America, which are all okay. Naming your child after negative historical figures is also outlawed, such as Adolfo or Adolf, or Benito, which would be referring to Benito Mussolini. Parents have ended up in court, and in 2018, a Milano couple had to explain to a judge why they named their daughter Blue. The offending law states that a child's name must correspond to the child's gender. Apparently, someone felt Blue could only be a boy's name. The parents explain that Blue is an acronym. It stands for Bella, Luminosa, and Unica, or beautiful, full of light, and unique. They were told they had to choose a new acceptable name or the judge would decide one for them. In the end, they were lucky. It had taken almost 2 years to be seen by a judge. At this point, they made the case that the little girl was so used to her name after 2 years it would be traumatizing to change it. Yara means butterfly in Arabic. Yara herself said that she was always having to spell her name for people, as it was not a common name in Italy, and she was the only Yara anyone around their town had ever met. And everyone around town would have known Yara. It was a very small place and the type of town where everyone knew everything about everyone. And Yara was an easy girl to know. She was an active girl, involved in sports and school, with plenty of friends. There are pictures of her with short hair and long hair, with her beautiful braces and before braces. Many pictures of her with her rhythmic gymnastics squad, wearing sports jerseys, or a really well-known picture where she is wearing the Italian national football team shirt in bright blue with the Italian flag. Yara diligently kept a diary, the type mixed with stories, anecdotes, and full of colorful drawings of unicorns and rainbows. Just a young girl who only recently became a teenager. In one quote from her diary, she said, "As far as I'm concerned, rhythmic gymnastics is the greatest sport in the world." In fact, Yara worked hard to be part of this team. She trained often, and this meant she spent time at the nearby sports center. Almost every town in Italy will have its own Centro Sportivo, or multi-sports center. Usually there is a pool, an indoor gymnasium with basketball and other multi-sport use areas, a football field, athletics area, maybe tennis courts, and unlike a private health center, the prices are reasonable for residents. It is run by the local government and meant to be a place for all ages. The Centro Sportivo in Brabante was only 700 meters from Yara's home. The center had classes like hip-hop, which her brother did, and had a strong rhythmic gymnastics team. Yara was used to walking back and forth between her home and her training and was familiar with the sports center and the staff. It was late afternoon, November 26, 2010. Yara had promised her gymnastics coach that she would drop off her dad's stereo at the sports center. The stereo they had at the center had been acting up, and rhythmic gymnastics is nothing without music. It makes practice impossible, and they had a big competition coming up in only a few days. Yara, being Yara, had already volunteered to bring a stereo from home so they could get back to practicing. As she was only 13, she spoke with her mother about her plans to walk over and leave the stereo. Her mother reminded her not to stay long, to be back in time for dinner, about 6:45 p.m. Yara left her house that Thursday evening, about 5:15 p.m., walking in snowy, frigid weather, though, being from the Alps, she didn't give that a second thought. Yara's mother expected her back by 6:45 p.m. By 7 p.m., she was worried. At 7:11 p.m., she called Yara's cell phone, but the call went straight to voicemail. At 7:30 p.m., Fulvio, Yara's father, called the police. The magistrate on duty at the public prosecutor's office was Letizia Ruggeri. Ruggeri had developed a great reputation in law enforcement for her time working in Sicily and her tough stance on organized crime fighting Cosa Nostra. She would end up taking this case very seriously from the moment she received the call and for the next almost 4 years that it would take to come to a resolution. Later, she said she jumped on it immediately because she was a mother and had a daughter about the same age as Yara, making this a very emotional case for her. The investigators and police worked many angles, but the first would be the usual angle when there is a disappearance. Check those closest, such as family. The police questioned the Gambirasio family. Were there arguments, dark secrets, a rift in the relationship? Could she have run away? Luckily, the police fairly quickly and easily ruled out the family and the idea that she had ran away. She hadn't left with any extra items, only her cell phone, the stereo, and the clothes she was wearing. Plus, everyone they spoke to painted a picture of a typical 13-year-old girl who was close to her parents and siblings, active in her community, and had a nice social circle. There was no way this girl would disappear on her own. They questioned the father. He was in construction, which is known to be a sector of conflict and potential bad blood. Maybe this was an act of revenge, so they wanted to know if Fulvio had any enemies. He denied this, and most accounts were that this was a nice, middle-class family. The police sequestered all the family computers, Yara's diary, and tapped the phones of the whole family. Police interviewed the other trainers at the sports center. The sports center had security cameras, but of course none of them were working. It wasn't written anywhere, but often in Italy at that time period, businesses would order fake cameras on eBay and put them around the buildings to give a sense of security without having to actually spend the big bucks. The trainers did say that they saw her leave about 6:30, or maybe it was 6:40. They couldn't be sure, as everyone was busy doing something around that time. They interviewed as many people as they could that had been at or near the sports center around that time, hoping for witnesses. A few people said they'd seen two men, possibly in conversation with Yara, standing near a red car. But there was little more to go on than that. Tracker dogs had arrived. They were given Yara's scent and started at the sports center. Instead of taking the direction toward Yara's home as investigators would have expected, the dogs went in a different direction altogether, towards a small hamlet nearby called Mappello, about 3 kilometers away. In the meantime, they had received Yara's cell phone data. Her last communication was at 6:44 p.m. to her friend Martina. It was a message agreeing to meet at 8 a.m. on Sunday morning. The last 3 pings on her phone were between 6:44 and 6:55 from cell phone towers in areas about 3 to 4 kilometers apart each time, leading investigators to think she was possibly in a car, but this part is not clear. One ping at 6:49 was in the very Mappello where dogs had tracked her scent. Her final ping was at 6:55 p.m., and after that her phone was silenced. The prosecutor Ruggeri put wiretaps on hundreds of phones. Her team also tried to trace the owner of all the cell phones, approximately 15,000, which had passed through Mappello on the day of Yara's disappearance. One of these belonged to a Moroccan man called Mohamed Fikri. In one wiretapped conversation in late November, the Arabic interpreter heard the phrase, "Forgive me, God, I didn't kill her." Fikri had been working at a construction site in Mappello, but by the time investigators had put the pieces together, a few days later, he was already on a boat bound for Tangiers. On December 4th, Italian authorities intercepted the boat and arrested Mohamed Fikri. They searched the van he had been using and discovered that it contained a blood-stained mattress. The arrest consumed the media, and people were happy to have what they considered a good suspect arrested, an immigrant from Morocco. He maintained his innocence. It turned out he had a solid alibi, having been at work, and his employer vouching for his presence. But most of all, he told them he had never said anything about killing anyone. When they finally cross-checked the translation with non-professional translators, so just Arabic-speaking people living in Italy, they all translated the phrase very differently. What he had said was, "Please, God, let her answer the phone." Mohammed was crying because his girlfriend had broken up with him and she wasn't answering his calls. This added to the ongoing political theater always present in Italy and was an excuse for opposing groups to call the prosecutor Ruggeri to step down. They accused her of moving too slowly with the investigation, and they declared she made too many mistakes, such as the giant disaster of Mohamed Fikri, who was wrongly accused. As the weeks passed, Brembate found itself at the center of a mystery which had captured the country's imagination. Italian television was dominated by cronache nere, crime news, and now the national camera crews descended. The Gambirasio family were horrified by the sudden glare of publicity. TV cameras became a permanent fixture in their quiet cul-de-sac. The family locked themselves away, lowering their shutters. Instead of being front and center and raising awareness, nuns from Yara's school came to pray inside the Gambirasio home. The rare statements from the parents were devout pleas for privacy and patience. Much was made of this behavior, but most Italians had come to understand that this area of Italy reacts differently. This setting was part of what fascinated the Italian public about Yara's disappearance. The province of Bergamo seemed to represent two different sides of the country. Where Lower Bergamo, towards the plains, is fashionable, well-connected, and industrialized, Alpine Bergamo is agricultural, remote, and deeply traditional. A close-knit place which nurtures suspicion, even superstition. Some locals talk of this being a land of streghe, of witches, who steal or poison young children. That sunny Saturday afternoon in February was the day Yara's body was finally found. 3 months in a field, the body was in a state of advanced decomposition. Besides being dressed exactly as she had been, they found near her body her house keys and iPod. They also found the battery and SIM card of her phone, but not the phone itself. The autopsy revealed a dozen knife lacerations to her throat and back, which were too superficial to have caused her death. She had lost consciousness and died of exposure, investigators concluded. She had also suffered blows to the back of the head, and they also found lime powder and iron particles on her clothes, which are items consistent with construction sites. Despite the time that had passed since her death, police forensic scientists found several good samples of DNA material from other people on her body. Lieutenant Colonel Michele Larusso of the Raggruppamento Opere Speciali, a special unit of the Carabinieri, was leading the murder investigation. He said, "Despite exposure to the wind, rain, and snow, these 2 DNA traces were excellent, and we were able to exclude saliva and sperm, so that left blood." Gambirasio had not been raped, said Larusso, but he did not exclude sexual motivation for the attack. Her bra was also found to be unhooked. After Gambirasio's death, the police launched a massive screening program, which involved not just combing DNA databanks, but administering 15,000 voluntary DNA tests on men and women, mostly men, living in the area. Nothing so large had ever been attempted anywhere in the world before, said Giorgio Portera, a former Carabinieri lieutenant and now a geneticist, let alone in Italy, he said. The prosecutor's office had basically launched the genetic screening of an entire territory. Among those asked to undergo the voluntary DNA tests were young men who frequent a disco called Le Sabbie Mobili, or quicksand, near the field where Yara's body was found. Of these men was Damiano Guerinoni, whose DNA was very similar to that of the DNA found on Yara's body that police had already identified as the DNA of the killer. According to scientists, Damiano was unquestionably a close relative of the killer. The police began to investigate his family. Through research, interviews, and work with the scientists, they were fairly sure they would find the direct match within his family tree. They did finally arrive at one of his uncles, a deceased bus driver named Giuseppe Guerinoni, who they thought could be the father, but they needed to test his DNA. In September 2012, they went to the house of his widow. Giuseppe had been dead about 11 years. The fastidious widow had kept all of his remaining items so clean that nothing was of any use to investigators. However, on his old driver's license was a stamp containing enough saliva to run a DNA test. Giuseppe Guerinoni, who had died in 1999, aged 61, had 3 children with his wife, who were quickly excluded as suspects. It was clear then that he must have also had a male child, out of wedlock, and that this child was the killer. The DNA on the stamp was insufficient because DNA trace was feeble. So in March 2013, his body was exhumed and samples of his DNA were taken from one of his femurs. Now they were 100% sure via science he was the father of the killer, and now police had to track down the illegitimate child of the dead bus driver. The best way to do this was identify his mother, who would have been a lover of Guerinoni. But how could she be found? Guerinoni's widow was of no help. She was in the dark about her dead husband's extramarital activities. The police reconstructed a biography of Guerinoni's private life and of every single woman he had ever known. Larusso, the lead investigator, said at the time, "We were met by a wall of silence, the kind of omertà that you would associate not with the north of Italy, but with Sicily and the mafia. But in the end, we got there by means of patient, painstaking legwork." The police tracked down the woman from her DNA. Police identified 532 women who the dead bus driver had known in his life and with whom he could have had sexual relations. They DNA tested them all first from 2012 through 2013 and then did a second round again in 2014. These women included Esther Arzuffi, now 67. Her DNA was a perfect match for that found on the dead girl, perfect in the sense that she is the mother of the killer, or so investigators believed. She had the female part of the DNA of Ignoto Uno, or Unknown One, which was the name investigators had given to the killer. Esther had been married to the same man, Giovanni Bossetti, since 1967, when she was 19 years old. The couple had 3 children, 2 twins, a boy and a girl, born in 1970, and a younger son. The father of all 3, everyone had always assumed, was her husband. But the DNA test revealed that the father of her twins was not her husband, but this dead bus driver, Giuseppe Guarinoni. In other words, her eldest son, Massimo Giuseppe Bossetti, now stood accused of being the killer. The police soon arrived at Massimo Giuseppe Bossetti, an apparently happily married 43-year-old carpenter who had 3 children aged 13, 10, and 7, and whose only quirk seemed to be a passion for sun lamp massage parlors. One Sunday evening in June 2014, the police set up a roadblock near Massimo Bossetti's home and flagged down his car. He was with his wife and 3 children. They gave him a breathalyzer test, and he passed, so they let him proceed. But they now had his DNA on the breathalyzer tube, which they swiftly sent off to the lab for analysis. The match between the DNA on the breathalyzer tube and the DNA on the dead girl's clothing was clear. To be precise, it showed 21 compatible markers. 16 to 17 are normally considered enough. This meant that the police and their forensic experts were almost completely sure that he was the killer. The Italian Home Secretary himself released a statement announcing his arrest. Reaction in the mountains of Bergamo, center of the investigation, was relief. The murder suspect was from the lower Bergamo. Investigators had also discovered plenty of circumstantial evidence. Massimo had frequently hung around Yara's house. He parked his car behind the sports center and ate at the Toscanaccia pizzeria at the end of her road. He had gone for regular UV showers at a tanning shop nearby, and his internet searches were troubling, using search words which implied a compulsion for very young girls. More pertinently, records suggested that his phone had been present in Brembate di Sopra on the evening of Yara's disappearance, but had been switched off from 5:45 p.m. until the following morning at 7:34 a.m. Massimo's mother, Esther, has spoken only once to the media, denying having an affair with the bus driver, but admitting that she had known him as a young woman. She waved aside the DNA match, describing it as inexplicable, and said, "I did not have an affair with him, unless my mind is playing tricks." Meanwhile, 2 other men had come forward to tell magistrates that they had had affairs with Esther. One sad outcome is Esther's husband, who had to find out with the rest of Italy that 2 of his 3 children are not biologically his. Despite all of the scientific evidence and some circumstantial evidence, there remain doubts about the alleged culpability of Massimo Bossetti. One main point that bothered some was the lack of evidence of a motive. Massimo's wife, Marita Comi, broke her silence eventually in a television interview, in which she proclaimed her husband's innocence. "They cannot explain to us how his DNA was found on Yara's clothes," she said. "I have never had suspicions about him. We always ate dinner together at 7:30 p.m., at the latest 8 p.m., and he was always there, as he was that night." There remain doubts as well about the accuracy of DNA analysis. On August 19, 2002, for example, a 24-year-old Italian woman, Annalisa Vincentini, was shot dead on the coast in Tuscany. Several months later, the Italian police said that DNA traces found on her corpse matched perfectly those of a 23-year-old British barman from Liverpool, who, as a result, had been arrested by British police under an international arrest warrant. Yet, according to some 20 witnesses, the barman was on duty in the pub where he worked in Liverpool on the day of the murder, and furthermore, he had never been to Italy. There was no suggestion that he was anything other than completely innocent. Subsequently, the police admitted that they had bungled the DNA match between the samples sent from Italy and those of the barman in their DNA databank. Indeed, in this case, investigators had to do the DNA screening of the 532 women who might have had an illegitimate child with a bus driver twice. The first screening, in 2012, did not identify the mother of the killer, whereas the second screening at the beginning of 2014 did. In the first screening, scientists tested only the nucleus and the DNA samples from the women, but they had discovered that the nucleus of the DNA on Yara's body was damaged and too poor for a match with the mother, although it was fine for a match with the father. In the second screening, they tested the mitochondria that surround the nucleus of the DNA, which contains more female traces. In January 2015, a scientific advisor to the court stated that the mtDNA of Ignoto Uno might not match that of Massimo, and that there might be the possibility of an error. According to rumors, as early as July 2013, the DNA showed no correspondence with the genetic maternal line of Massimo Bossetti. Bossetti's lawyer said that there is an obvious anomaly. The mitochondrial DNA does not match the nuclear DNA. This should at least make us raise a question whether the whole process which led to the identification of DNA has been done with the most absolute correctness or not. Massimo has also stated that he suffered from chronic nosebleeds and that someone had stolen his work tools, including a knife, an awl, and a trowel, possibly blood-soiled from the nosebleeds, and that the DNA proof was fabricated due to either excessive exposure to the weather or cross-contamination. As his lawyers had said, the DNA they found only confirms presence, not responsibility. This direction could fit with a local conspiracy item about the murder, that Massimo did not have anything to do with the murder and he was framed. Roberto Saviano, author of the well-known book Gomorra, claims that Yara's father Fulvio was involved with a company owned by Patrizio Locatelli, son of Pasquale Locatelli, a leading drug lord belonging to the Italian Camorra organized crime syndicate. Saviano suggests that Yara was killed as revenge for Fulvio testifying against Locatelli. It has not been proved that Fulvio testified and has been refuted by Fulvio himself, but it is a persistent alternative theory that the real killer isn't Massimo. One more alternative theory was put out there. There was blood found on the sleeve of Yara's jacket, identified by DNA as belonging to an instructor at the gym, Silvia Brena. On the night of Yara's disappearance, Silvia Brena's father had said that she cried all night, and no explanation had been given for this. Remember, no one but the immediate family knew she was missing at that point. Under questioning, she said that she remembered nothing and could not explain why she and her brother had sent text messages to each other at the time of Yara's disappearance, which they had almost immediately deleted, without deleting other messages sent before or after. Despite his claims of innocence and of possible mistakes or issues with the DNA matching, on July 1, 2016, the court of Bergamo sentenced Massimo Bossetti to life imprisonment. This ruling has been upheld through several attempts at appeal. The Gambirasio family, meanwhile, has remained private. Recently, while awarding a gymnastics trophy named after their daughter, Yara Gambirasio struggled to smile and made no public comments. Yara is buried between her two grandparents in a cemetery just across the road from the sports center she loved so much. All around the grave are mementos left by her friends and family: gym shoes, a metal tulip, rag dolls, plastic angels, and little bracelets. The disappearance and murder of 13-year-old Yara only a few hundred meters from her house shocked and terrorized Italy, and the subsequent dogged investigation led by Letizia Ugeri and her team was impressive. Tens of thousands of DNA samples and hundreds of hours of lab work and research led to the arrest of a man caught by forensic science. Thank you for listening to Italian True Crime, the English-language podcast for Italophiles interested in lesser-known Italian crime and murder stories. Doing research for these crimes, I normally read articles or listen to Italian videos that cover the cases. This time there was a Netflix movie. It came out last year and is called simply Yara. Obviously it is a movie and will have fictitious dialogue and recreation of events. But it was so much more emotional than a podcast, which is good for facts but can seem cold. If you have the opportunity, it's only a 90-minute film, and you will see and feel the reality of that time 12 years ago when Yara disappeared.